Hello and welcome. My name is Sanjay Patnaik. I'm the Director of the Center on Relational Markets here at the Brookings Institution. We are here today for a very interesting event on AI, emerging technologies, and the division of domestic labor. For decades, if not centuries, women have disproportionately managed household labor, including domestic tasks, child-rearing, elder care, and many other caregiving activities. And even as women's participation in the paid labor force, mainly in a lot of developed nations, has increased, the gender division of unpaid domestic labor persists. And so now we enter an age where we have a lot of advances in artificial intelligence. And so the questions get raised, might these advances in AI, for instance, autonomous vehicles or delivery robots for food and groceries or large language models, might those impact the division of domestic labor and the unpaid domestic labor that we have seen the burden falling on women for such a long time? And so today I'm joined by three really distinguished, outstanding experts here, and we will explore questions such as, to what extent have scholars considered the role of AI and domestic labor? Are there specific areas of household labor tasks that can benefit from the application of emerging technologies? And what impact might these have on the gender division of household roles that we often see? And so we are starting off with a keynote address by Dr. Ekaterina Hertog. She's Associate Professor in AI and Society at the Oxford Internet Institute and the Ethics in AI Institute at Oxford University. Welcome, Ekaterina. It's a real pleasure to have you here. And I will hand it over to you for your keynote remarks before we dive into the panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Sanjay. I'm really excited to be here. Just give me 10 seconds to share my screen. Okay. All right. So really great to be here today to talk about AI, emerging technologies, and the division of domestic labor. So I'm based at Oxford University, and today I'm largely going to be presenting my research funded by the Economic and Social Research Council. So Sanjay already touched upon this, but I just wanted to spend a minute or two talking a little bit about unpaid domestic work and how it relates to paid work and so on. Many of us would have come across newspaper articles, academic research, policy papers on paid work and automation. What are the implications? How much of the current occupations, paid jobs, could be overtaken by smart technologies in the near future? What would that mean? How would we care for people who've lost their jobs? I haven't seen much research yet looking at similar consequences in case of the unpaid domestic work. And yet, as I think is captured very nicely in this image on the left here by the Red Women's Workshop, unpaid work, or sometimes referred to as reproductive labor, are really essential. No societies can continue, no paid work can really be done if no one's cooking meals, keeping homes warm and tidy, cares for children, raising potentially new workers for old or sick or any family members in need of care. Not only unpaid work is very important, it's also very time consuming. And I pulled the numbers from time use surveys in UK and in Japan and looked at them by gender, so by men and women. And this takeaway from this bar chart, there are really two core points. First of all, unpaid domestic work is quite time consuming. And at some stages in life, for some people, it's comparable or takes longer, more time than paid labor. It's also shared very unequally. As you can see, in both sort of example countries here, in Japan and in the UK, men do more paid work and women do considerably more housework and care work than men. This is true everywhere in the world. There are differences between countries in how big the gap is, but women always do, again, as Sanjay already highlighted, everywhere women spend more time on housework and care work than men. And this comes at a price. Again, many of us have heard about motherhood penalty or caregiver penalty. And for example, this refers to the loss in wages, lifelong earnings, career progression, and other consequences that serious care responsibilities, child care responsibilities, have on sort of one's career and work trajectory. Well, digital technologies, new smart emerging technologies, AI seems to hold promise to address some of these issues. And while, as I've said, there hasn't been much direct academic research that I've seen that sort of addresses the issue head on. Companies and consumers have really taken notice. This graph I created based on the annual reports of the International Federation of Robotics. So a couple of caveats. This International Federation of Robotics counts just the number of robots, which it divides into 4 distinct categories. Household service robots, these are largely vacuum cleaners, lawnmowers, floor mops, and such. Household entertainment robots, professional service robots. Here you could think about sort of robots moving around, sterilizing hospital equipment, or robots used in elder care homes, for example. And finally, industrial robots, perhaps building cars and so on. These numbers don't include any sort of smart algorithms that we use, for example, when doing our grocery shopping, and that also are type of emerging technologies that can save time spent on domestic labor. So this is sort of very much of an undercount, but I think the picture is instructive. This graph is instructive as it documents an interest. As we can see from 2010 up to 2019, which are the years for which I had the relevant reports, there have been more household service robots sold in terms of units than any other type of robots. Moreover, as we can see from around 2017, the interest and the sort of purchase of household service robots has really accelerated, and we haven't seen quite such a rise in uptake in other types of robots. So when this technology, there seems to be a huge interest in this technology. As it becomes available, consumers are keen to take it on. So this seems to be solving some kind of problem. Here are some examples of robots that exist. We've heard about. There is a vacuum cleaner on the left, the sort of child teaching Pega robot on the right, the smart baby crib that has AI technology to adjust how it will rock the baby to make its promises that the baby will sleep more and kind of be calmer because of this smart crib. And I bought a dog, which has been used in elder care, for example. So in my project, the domestic AI project, and you could see there's a project website at the bottom of this graph if you would like more details and look at some of the papers we published. We've started by we started with an expert survey. We were really sort of interested in the question, well, if robots are going to take away paid work, can they at least also take our trash? Can they take away some of the sort of less glamorous domestic drudgery, maybe? So we have divided all housework and care work tasks into about, I think this is 17 tasks, and we came up with this categorization based on the categorization of unpaid domestic labor in time use surveys, which is the most sort of widely accepted and common way of measuring unpaid domestic labor. And we came up with the 17 tasks, and then we approached experts working broadly in AI smart technologies field. We tried to look for people who worked on technologies that would be relevant for domestic automation in UK and in Japan. And we asked them a number of questions, one of which was, well, what proportion of time currently spent on a given domestic task, cooking, dishwashing, cleaning, could be saved through automation in 10 years' time? The question used the current situation, for example, the current technological situation as the basis. So not washing dishes by hand, but we already have dishwashers. For laundry, we have washing machines. So given that, how much more time proportionately could we spend in 10 years' time? And there are two, I think, important takeaways from this bar chart. First of all, across all the tasks, we can see that experts predict a significant amount of automation in 10 years' time. So a lot of time saved. Even in the most, I think the lowest prediction is physical childcare. They expect about 20% of time can be saved through technologies as they develop currently and the current trajectory. Many other tasks, especially housework tasks, they see as much more automatable. So the first, experts predict a fair amount of automation across the board in domestic labor. And the second takeaway is, very broadly speaking, housework tasks, especially routine housework like dishwashing, cleaning, cooking, and grocery shopping, are seen as much more automatable than broadly speaking, care tasks that you can see on your right with a kind of pink and purple bars. So housework, unpaid work is automatable, especially housework, but even care work automatable too. And this could have a potential to transform our everyday life. What are the possible social consequences of it? I think this raises many questions. As we have seen, unpaid work takes a lot of time, plays a major role in our life. There could be really positive social transformations as a result of these developments. For example, as I've pointed out already, domestic work is shared very unequally between household members. Women do a lot more of it. At the same time, the prediction is that routine domestic work, which is actually tends to be particularly dominated by women, are also the kind of domestic work, a type of housework that's the most automatable. So theoretically, if you think about this trajectory, potentially women stand to benefit the most. If everyone who wants could adopt, any household, any individual could adopt this technology, then to some extent we could, for example, you could reduce the issue of gender gap in domestic labor. Women disproportionately benefit from this time savings. Of course, there is an important caveat. Everyone can afford and adopt this technology. As we know, in reality, that doesn't necessarily work out this way. If, for example, these emerging technologies come with serious price tag, we could potentially result in access inequality where richer households benefit, save time, and simultaneously sort of stop employing poorer women. It usually tends to be women to help them with cleaning, cooking, and babysitting, and now have these shiny new robots to save time and increase their free time, while poorer households can't benefit from the technologies and from these emerging technologies, and also potentially lose some of the jobs that they have been doing. There are also other potential consequences, darker consequences as well. Unpaid domestic work is similar to work in some ways in that it's time consuming. It can be, some of it can be quite repetitive and can be unrewarding, like floor cleaning for me, for example. But it's not just work. It has a big component of care into it. It's how people express love, how they build family relationships, and so on. If significant amounts of all of these tasks, or maybe especially the caring tasks, are taken over by technology, that could lead to a long-term change in domestic interactions and in family relations. Another thing, because domestic work has such a large care component to it, it's usually anyone providing that care needs to know a lot about the individual they're caring for. So maybe my vacuum cleaning robot doesn't need to know too much about me, but what about a cooking robot? It probably needs to know about the allergies in the family, any health conditions, food preferences, and so on. This information for the new cooking robot to do its work well, it will probably need to know this information. And then who is going to own it? Where is that information going to go? There's this potential risks of severe loss, of gigantic loss of privacy. Another thing, again, as we know from some of the domestic technologies, and that is, one is a smart doorbell comes to mind, the Ring, which on the one hand has a potential of, say, I need to go to work and yet I need to let the plumber in because I've got a problem. Well, I can use my smart camera and let the plumber in remotely. So it could let me stay at work and not sort of spend time on commuting. On the other hand, of course, this type of technologies have capabilities for surveillance. They enable me not just to let the plumber in, but I could watch anyone who enters this household, who is visiting my family, when my family members are moving in and out of the house, and perhaps what are they doing on the doorstep, whom are they talking to, and so on. And in certain situations, especially when there are big power inequalities between family members, and in extreme cases, if there's abusive relationships, there again, big risks associated with these types of emerging technologies when they're employed in private homes. We're not quite yet ready for that. I don't think we've thought quite enough about that at this point. And yet these technologies are very much available now already. Finally, one of the things that's discussed a lot at the Ethics and AI Institute in particular, there's a concern about emotional attachment to caring technologies. Many of us have sort of been exploring ChatGPT, for example. It's amazingly well at chatting, and it's very good at chatting, and kind of perhaps can appear caring if I ask it to sort of sound like that, for example. It can seem give a semblance of human interaction if these technologies improve and are employed in care as a conversational partners at some point, for example, through a digital voice assistant or technology like that. There is a risk of some family members or an individual developing an emotional attachment to a caring technology. And if that technology is produced by a sort of profit-oriented company, again, there are risks arising there because the company owns the technology. If I have an emotional attachment to it, I could end up in a situation where I'm willing to pay quite a lot of money to not have it switched off. I need regular updates and who knows what. So there's many the possible positive outcomes, but there are many risks that come from the fact that there's domestic work is very wrapped into households and well-being. And these are the points that I think it's high time that we start thinking about. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Really interesting statistics and interesting thoughts here. I want to turn over to our other two panelists, which are really distinguished as well. We have Dr. Beth Humberd, Associate Professor and Department Chair of Management at the Manning School of Business at UMass Lowell, and Dr. Elizabeth Altman, Associate Professor of Management at the Manning School of Business, University of Mass Lowell, and also a guest editor at The Future of the Workforce at MIT's Lowell Management Review. Welcome, Beth and Elizabeth. Thank you so much for joining. I'd like to turn to you because you're working on a paper, actually, a Brookings paper that talks that really focuses on the gender division of household labor and emerging technology and kind of like what promise AI has in that space. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of like the research questions that you are interested in here? Maybe Liz, if you can start off.
Sure. I was actually going to pop it over to Beth to start off, but
that's fine also.
All right, Beth, why don't you take it to start, and then we'll come back.
Sure. So thank you, Sanjay, and that was a great presentation, Ekaterina. So I think it actually dovetails nicely with what Ekaterina was sharing in terms of some of the statistics. What Liz and I have looked at is our kind of first research question builds on what you just saw in that presentation, looking at how might these emerging technologies have an impact on domestic labor in the household, which is what Ekaterina was getting at. But then the second part is, and in what ways might that impact the gender division of domestic labor? And so we've been trying to look for kind of those nuggets of promise, as Sanjay has said. And we think that we are finding some interesting possible areas that make these technologies different than kind of labor-saving devices in the past, which Ekaterina touched on. And also, even though I tend to be, I am kind of more of a researcher on looking at gender and professions and occupations and tend to be somewhat pessimistic that we're ever going to break these kind of persistent barriers, we did find an area that we feel like there could be unique promise of these technologies. So those are kind of our research questions. I'm teasing a little bit of our findings, but I'll pause there, Sanjay, and see where you want to head next.
That's great. And so maybe, Liz, if you can talk a little bit about kind of like what kind of groupings of technologies do you see there having a potential impact on domestic labor and on that gender division of household labor?
Great. And also, first of all, thanks so much for having us. It is a pleasure to be here and always fun to be on these types of panels with you, Sanjay. So we started looking at AI and looking at autonomous vehicles, both, because we think there are a number of emerging technologies here. We just heard a lot about robotics from Ekaterina, and AI and autonomous vehicles are two other areas that we think hold a lot of promise. In terms of AI, one of the things that and again, starting to tease towards our findings, because it's hard to discuss it without where we're going. One of the things we've started to do is look at not only technologies that are within the house, but also technologies outside of the house that affect the house. So very simply, for example, GPS navigation technologies are not a technology that we would normally think of as within household labor or domestic labor. On the other hand, they have a huge impact on convenience, on scheduling, on planning, and how we kind of think about how we get places and how we get other people to and from places. Same thing with other types of platform technologies, Uber Eats or Grubhub or delivery platforms, any around the world. Those types of platforms are not technologies that we specifically think about as useful in the home. However, we use them to help domestic labor situations. So those are types of technologies that are AI driven in many instances and are outside the home and affect what happens in the home. We're also looking at technologies that are AI powered, that are within the home. And we're, again, looking at autonomous vehicles. So I'll stop there, but I can keep taking it further if you'd like, as you wish.
Perfect. That's actually a great opportunity to bring in Ekaterina. I was struck by your graph that you showed. I loved that graph. It kind of like really broke down the different tasks. And so what stood out to me is that it looked like the biggest savings in time that AI or new technology is promising looks like it's grocery shopping, cooking, and service use. Can you talk a little bit about kind of like the three categories, what the technologies could be that can really save the time, and what is that service use category? I guess grocery shopping is like delivery robots, things like that. Cooking would be cooking robots, but I'm curious to hear what technologies you see emerging in that space and where that big potential is coming from.
Yes, I think the experts generally, as they've seen earlier with the paid work, the predictions have always been more predictable, more routine, very repetitive tasks are easier to automate, and particularly with grocery shopping, as opposed to other types of shopping, is a good example because most of us cook fairly similar types of meals over sort of finite lengths of time, I don't know, repeating every couple of weeks and so on. So there could be better meal planning, for example. I mean, nodding to what Liz and Beth have been saying, so taking technologies that are sort of organizing things, perhaps taking out, I mean, maybe they could be machine learning algorithms that are trained and kind of know that, you know, you need yogurt every week, milk every 2 weeks, and the flour runs out after a month. So that could take all this mental load of planning and thinking about ordering. And it's very difficult to implement for unpredictable things, but repetitive orders are much more open to that. When we think about cooking, and I've been actually quite struck by Liz's and Beth's comment about thinking about technologies that are inside the home versus outside the home. We had a parallel to that when we were talking to the experts. And we also thought that, well, some of this domestic automation, I mean, has to happen in the home. My floor can only be washed by a robot that is in my house. However, things like cooking, for example, could be done theoretically. I mean, they're already done. We got Deliveroo that solves some of the problem. It's not, you know, there's a lot of human labor involved. It's not really only smart technologies, but it solves some of the problem. And we could have factory-sized sort of laundry spaces with humans or drones just sort of picking up and delivering, dropping off the laundry. Similar setup could happen for cooking. And I know that at least for laundry, that's really interesting because we were comparing UK and Japan. And in Japan, they keep trying to come up with a robot that can do all the laundry. You know, they throw everything in, it sorts, applies the right detergent, washes, irons, folds, and you come out. And I think a robot like that exists. It's the size of a room in a house. It's very, very expensive. So while technically it's possible, it's hugely impractical, and that's the obstacle. In the UK, I've heard of a couple of models that are really delivery-based at the moment with humans, but the idea is to build a kind of a smart factory or big space where everyone's laundry comes in and then, you know, it's delivered back to you, so you don't have it to happen in the home.
That's very interesting. So kind of like it's a combination probably of some of the back end work outside and then automated delivery vehicles that bring either food, cooked food or groceries or something, maybe in conjunction with a computer in your home that like automates your shopping list or whatever you need
or
to cook this.
The smart
or the laundry in this case.
Exactly.
Wow, that's interesting. And maybe like turning over to you, Beth, could you talk a little bit about like the aspect of automated vehicles and kind of like both like automated vehicles for transportation of people, but also kind of like transporting stuff like Ekaterina alluded to?
Sure. So actually, I'm going to build a little bit on Ekaterina's point and then maybe pass the AV to Liz. But what I wanted to draw attention to based on what we've been talking about here is this idea of time saving. which Ekaterina is talking a lot about, and I think makes sense. For those that don't know, a lot of the research that kind of finds this persistent gender division of domestic labor is based on time use studies, at least here in the US, that's run by the American Time Use Survey by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. And a lot of researchers and scholars and policymakers kind of scrub that data and look at who's spending time on what tasks within households, paid labor, unpaid labor, and that's where a lot of these trends come from. Very important, and of course, a huge area for labor-saving devices is, as Ekaterina has been saying, how can we save time and make things more efficient? What Ekaterina just teased up, and I'm going to kind of tease up to have Liz talk a little bit about autonomous vehicles. We see the real promise with these emerging technologies, less on that efficiency focus. There's obviously something there, but more on the managing, the cognitive offloading that some of these tools allow for. So artificial intelligence and applications that might help. I'll use a personal example. I have 2 children. They have a lot of activities. Each month I have to scrub through various emails and different sports platforms to gather their schedules. And then there's a change in schedule and I had to update the family calendar. This sounds, great. What's the big deal? Time saving. But if I could have some sort of tool that can find all that information for me, update some, automated whiteboard on the family, mudroom wall and handle that for me, that would take a huge cognitive load off of me that happens in kind of the managing of a household that isn't really, it is efficiency focused, but it's also me being at work. So-and-so needs to get here today. Who's going to pick them up for carpool? So we've kind of been trying to focus on, we've had a lot of labor saving devices in the past, the washing machine, the dishwasher, right? From what I can tell, and Ekaterina can correct me if I'm wrong, these have shifted where people spend their time, but haven't necessarily increased leisure time like we thought they would, right? Or maybe it allowed women to enter the paid workforce. However, then we have lower socioeconomic folks kind of in the home helping with cleaning and other things. So we're really trying to find what is that unique aspect of these emerging technologies that might offer promise. And if you Google anything about kind of women's second shift and what, working women are kind of plagued with these days, there's a lot out there in public conversation around that mental load, the cognitive and emotional labor that's involved in managing a household that maybe isn't captured in those time use studies. And so we think there is some promise there. And I'll pass off to Liz if you want to talk a little bit more specifically about autonomous vehicles.
Sure. I will get to autonomous vehicles, but I also want to build on 2 points that the two of you just made. So back to meal planning, for example, I thought it really struck me a few weeks ago. Some of my students were presenting about a meal service in the US, HelloFresh. And we think about meal planning as what we do, again, within the household, right? And as Ekaterina said, maybe we only order the same things relatively repetitively and cook the same things over time. But more and more people are using, for example, meal services. And as they become more effective and more efficient and more cost effective, and this is where autonomous vehicles and delivery services do play a role, that's all AI powered. And it's one thing now these days, if you're going to use a meal service, most of the meal services, at least again in the US, you need to put in a lot of preferences, right? And you need to go in and choose, we have a milk allergy, we have a this allergy, we have a that allergy, we are vegetarian, we have one vegan in the house, whatever the case may be. But if these systems, as they improve, and they already are, start to know this family tends not to like food that's very spicy. This family always ranks low or doesn't reorder things that have a lot of garlic or a lot of onions, whatever the case may be, then the system starts to know you much better than it ever has before. And eventually the system just sends you what is appropriate for your family. And again, so we think as those external systems improve, that does also help within the household. And the same thing, I guess, with autonomous vehicles. We've looked at, and we're starting to look more and more at how a family would use them, not only to move people, but to move goods. So to go pick up groceries, to go pick up dry cleaning, to go, as infrastructure evolves, to be able to go out and get things for us. And similarly, to have other entities bring things to us. And I think as we're looking at autonomous vehicles, we're looking at autonomous vehicles that might transport humans, but we're also looking at autonomous vehicles that transport goods, and that also includes drones. So it's, they don't have to all be land-based autonomous vehicles. They could be air-based autonomous vehicles, and those also are helpful and becoming much more available, accessible, and useful as these technologies continue to emerge.
Great. Yeah, please, Beth, go ahead.
I was just going to build one quick thing because it kind of bridges Liz's comment and Ekaterina's in terms of looking at kind of the darker side, or, not necessarily danger, darker side, but unintended consequences. I think when we talk about autonomous vehicles in particular and the moving of people, we always say research is me search, and we've been having a lot of conversations with people kind of in our personal spheres as we're digging into this. And I had a friend immediately jump on, I told her what I was working on, and the autonomous vehicles popped up, and she said, I actually, busy working mom, 3 kids, I really like that 10 minutes in the car with my son to drop him at practice because it's one of the only times we get to connect. So I actually think, again, the cognitive emotional offloading, or the task space that are kind of bringing goods that allow people to still have those relational moments with members of their family. I don't think that the gender division of domestic labor is looking to shift in a way that takes out the relational component of family life. It would be nice if it could take out the time suck and the cognitive load. So again, to Liz's point, I think the moving of goods and product would be probably more palatable to a family than necessarily the moving of humans, unless another one Liz and I talked about is multitasking, right? If I could, I guess you could do this with Uber right now, but long commute, if I could be doing work while I'm being driven somewhere, sure, that in that sense, the moving of humans, but not necessarily offloading care to autonomous vehicles.
And I guess I would just add to that, as we, so far, even in this conversation, we've considered autonomous vehicles one category, but even in there, as soon as you start to do more research on this, we have the SAA different levels of autonomy, right? So it's one thing if you have more like an autopilot. So yes, these conversations that happen in a car among family members are important. And I think many of us have, had some of our best conversations, but they also are distracting. And so if you can be an autonomous vehicle that is essentially driving itself, but you're kind of keeping an eye on it, right? And, one of the more middle levels on the scale, then that I can see happening. I mean, that can happen right now, essentially, right? When we have the technologies, and as those technologies become much more again, available, accessible, and prevalent, then I think that becomes a much more normal situation where a mother or father and child, for example, or other family members get in a car together and can do other things. They can be doing homework, et cetera, while the car is driving them, much more so than, I think, at least in the shorter term, than putting someone in a car and taking them somewhere else.
Ekaterina, I want to move over to you and bring you in here on this debate, especially on this distinction between the managing the mental load and the doing. And I think, how do you see so Beth and Liz mentioned earlier, we have these two components. We have the domestic labor itself, where we have the technology that can really save it. But then we have the gender division. And even though we have seen a lot of technological advances over the last 6 years, let's say washing machines, dishwashers, etc., the gender division has persisted. And I think oftentimes it's probably also driven partially culturally. So what do you see as some of the main factors behind that? And how do you see technology impacting this at all?
So that's interesting. And looking at looking historically, you're absolutely right. We had quite a big change over the course of the 20th century when washing machines, tumble dryers, refrigerators, loads of technology emerged, particularly household appliances. And before that, electricity and running water, they changed the way households operated, which kind of jobs have to be done within households. And what we saw that, of course, on the one hand, there was a big transformation, and there is some research showing linking household appliances with women being more able to join the labor market. But at the same time, these huge inequalities persist. And one of the big reasons there is that these appliances change the way we think about tasks as well. And this is what I'd expect to happen with the new smart technologies too. What happened with the washing machines, for example, is yes, they could free up individual time, mostly women probably, who were doing, all this laundry by hand, but they also raised the hygiene standards. So now the core task of scrubbing sort of time was saved, but all the surrounding tasks, the way we're sorting the laundry, arranging it, finding the right, they're all there and they've multiplied because we're now doing it not once a week, but I also have 2 children and I do it pretty much every day. Mine are boys as well. So I mean, drawing a parallel there is of course, it's very hard to predict in which ways the tasks will be transformed, but it will be very interesting to see. And I definitely expect that the tasks we're doing now will be transformed. And in some ways, we might have higher standards. Like if now I generally try to insist with my family that we try to share the dinner. I really, really don't like cooking 2 or 3 dinners, although I do end up doing that every so often. I think if there is a really smart technology that's able to cater for everyone, we might end up with every family member being able or feeling that they're able to order a separate meal for themselves and have one that fits their current mood or their food preferences and that will raise the tasks around it and organizing tasks around them. And I think one of the audience questions that you mentioned to me before is whether we think, what would be the knock-on effect on gender inequalities? Would these technologies transform the domestic sphere? And as I mentioned in the presentation, women stand to benefit disproportionately because they're currently doing these jobs disproportionately. However, some people anticipate that, men tend to like technologies. If we look at surveys and so on, they tend to be more positive, expect to be more confident, more capable with a variety of, including domestic technologies, actually. So maybe now if we get more robots, more gadgets doing domestic work, they would feel more sort of professional. They would feel that this is something that a man could and should be doing and would feel more professional about it. And that way we'll see a broader gender equality. On the other hand, as we've seen in the past, sometimes the new emerging tasks get allocated very much to women. As we have more smart technologies in the home, as all of us who experienced the lockdown, managing remote technologies, often remote schooling, there's a whole new job where you ensure your router works, everyone's gadgets are updated, and so on. And if we have more of the gadgets, there will be a whole new job of keeping them up to date, keeping them serviced, and so on. And whether it's going to fall to men, or whether because it's domestic sphere, it will get offloaded on women, the jury is probably still out.
No, this is very interesting, especially like if I remember correctly, when I looked at your graph, right, I think in the UK, it showed that women almost work the same number of hours in the paid professions, but then much more in the domestic, which is kind of crazy and really unfortunate because they have the double whammy when you think they will be freed up, but they work now in the regular jobs and then they come home and have to do much more of the housework. So it's really like hopefully that some of that technology can really change that. And I want to turn back to Liz and Beth, you came up with in your paper that you're working on, you're coming up with kind of like a very interesting framework.
Yes.
How you can integrate kind of like emerging technologies with domestic labor. Can you just talk a little bit about it and how you think through this problem?
Sure. So I think we slightly surprised ourselves and came up with 2 kind of aha moments as we've been going forward with this. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the first part of that, and then I'll hand it over to Beth, and then that will also wrap in with the framework, right? So the first kind of aha for us goes with what I was saying before, where it's not only the technology within the house, it's outside of the house, but it's also not only the technology affecting the person who's using the technology, but those related to or connected with that person. So we're essentially putting a relational lens on it. So, and a way to explain that is a very quick example that we've used, which is, and so one way to think about this is kind of first and second order effects, or direct and indirect effects, right? So most of the AI writing, articles, academic literature, et cetera, just presumes that the benefit accrues to the person using the AI, right? So we talk about like how that person's productivity will increase, but we don't talk much about the potential effects on those around that person. So this came up because we have a colleague who is using ChatGPT a lot. And he was at home with his son one day while our female colleague was with us at work. And they couldn't figure out what to do. So he used ChatGPT, and ChatGPT suggested a bunch of activities. Then he said, well, actually, it's raining outside. ChatGPT said, well, here's some activities. You could bake cookies. They said, okay. But then they realized they didn't have all the ingredients. So they had to ask ChatGPT, we don't have all the ingredients, but can we give us a recipe for only these? ChatGPT sent it to them. Then they realized the cookies weren't actually getting done. The cooking time was wrong. So they had to ask again, can you help us adjust the cooking time? So that may sound all very boring and normal, but none of those then required a call to our colleague, where in other cases, yes, he maybe could have used Google. That's also quite possible he would have called our friend, right? And so in this case, she was able to stay focused because of AI helping her partner, right? And so that made us realize is not only helped the partner, her husband, but it helped her as well, because it kept them much more able to keep doing what they were doing. And you can imagine the same thing with tutoring. Khan Academy has a new system, Conmigo, that is supposed to be, I've only started looking at, but it's supposed to be fantastic, right? And this, we can just imagine this getting better and better. I heard Ethan Mollick speak yesterday, and he said, don't forget, whatever AI you use today is the worst AI you will ever use, right? Which I just think is a excellent way of thinking about it. And so we've been thinking about these kind of second order effects, right? How, especially again, if you think about a family as a system, so I study ecosystems and platforms. I normally study workforce ecosystems, but if you apply that same thinking within the family, you have these interdependencies, complementarities, relationships within the family. And so that's one of our ahas, is how does this affect not only people using the technology, but also the others? And I will let Beth talk about our other aha, and that we then kind of roll together into a framework.
Yeah, great. And I think it is a good example. Again, it's kind of one that came up haphazardly, and you could say, well, there was other ways to do that. But the kind of illustrative point there is it wasn't necessarily a task savings for our friend, the working female, but rather kind of a cognitive savings. And so what we've been trying to do with our emerging framework that Sanjay mentioned is really separate out the doing of domestic labor from the managing. And then as we delved further into some of the literature on gender division of household labor, scholars are starting to look at that. Well, in the managing are components of that cognitive and are components of that emotional managing. And so our emerging framework kind of looks at AI and AV, and then some of the capabilities within that, visualizing, predicting, deciding, leading, assisting, right? These you can imagine are different capabilities of the technology, and kind of intersecting those with components of managing household labor. So the doing is the task, but then within managing, you need to kind of anticipate, right? Like, who's going to need a ride somewhere this week? What are we going to need for food? The planning, right? Well, once we understand who's going to need a ride where, we need to engage in planning for that. The deciding, well, how are we going to decide who ends up here or there, what we're going to have for a meal, or who manages the broken, the appliance man coming because the dishwasher broke, and then finally overseeing. So those are, we kind of have anticipating, planning, deciding, and overseeing as sub pathways of managing domestic labor, and are intersecting, for example, artificial intelligence. Okay, under planning, virtual assistants, scheduling, as it improves, in what way might it predict, right? Last week, X, Y, and Z happened in the household. We are going to give you kind of a starting point for next week's family schedule. I'm obviously very kind of biased by my own situation, but that is for me where the cognitive load comes in. I will be working, but I'm tabulating all of this in my head and take a break and make sure that somebody is anticipating or has scheduled or has planned, right? Already texted my mom for next week. Hey, you're going to be able to get the kids off the bus on Tuesday. So this is very now focused, but to Liz's point, as the technology improves in its ability to visualize, predict, decide, lead, you can imagine those components of managing potentially this idea of cognitive offloading that we've heard some of the folks in the AI world talk about becoming more synergistic with the area of domestic labor, and not discounting also the efficiency-based time use savings that are there as well. We're just trying to emerge on this framework to say conceptually, what are some areas where the promise of these emerging technologies may lie in helping to manage that gender division of labor. And I do just want to give a little bit of a plug here. I have an area of research with some colleagues that has looked at the changing nature of fatherhood in the context of women's increasing paid employment. We have seen this gap in the time spent on domestic labor narrow somewhat. Fathers are more involved than they ever have been before, more involved in caregiving and managing of the household. And so to Ekaterina's point, you could see as much as kind of the output of that is yes, but women still do a lot of the cognitive managing. If there are technologies involved, our friend said her husband's like a chat GPT geek. So he kind of just stumbled on doing this, right? So you might even see that kind of nagging gap take hold if the technology becomes more attractive to men who are interested in it, and then can, by nature of that, take some of this anticipating, planning, scheduling over.
That's actually a really interesting point, and also about the changing role of fatherhood, because I do think we see significant changes to if we look at our grandfather's generation or even our father's generation, right? And so what always strikes me as very interesting about the current times we live in is that the changes we are seeing, the rapid technological changes, I think are on a scale and speed that are unprecedented, even if we go back to the Industrial Revolution, and most people, I don't think, realize it. And so I want to go back to you, Ekaterina, because you brought up a couple of things that you called kind of like the dark side. And so I want to turn a little bit to the risks and also the policy implications, since we are here, the policy think tank, and like how policymakers can think about these issues. And so, Ekaterina, we got a couple of really interesting audience questions. I want to ask one here. Are there any unintended consequences that you see that could arise from that widespread adoption of domestic automation, and particularly in terms of like employment, social dynamics, etc.? Because obviously a lot of the domestic tasks, especially in wealthier households, are currently being done by employees from lower socioeconomic ranks, like Beth had mentioned. So how do you see kind of like these employment dynamics, the labor market dynamics, and also social dynamics play out as these technologies become more available?
Yeah, so thanks for the questions. In terms of the social dynamics, kind of currently, it's not unusual for middle class, at least for middle class households, to employ lower income, usually women, to do some of these jobs. And these are the jobs that could of course disappear as these technologies get better and can take over. The interesting question there, and that's where I think the future research should go to, is to see whether we're going to be also equally open to replacing human labor with technology labor. So say, I really don't care who scrubs my floor as long as it's not me. If it's a vacuum cleaner, or if it's, I feel bad, but like in terms of morally, if it's a human cleaner or a robot cleaner, I don't mind. But if it comes to a nanny, for example, I'm probably at the moment would be much more comfortable leaving my child in the care of a human. I would sort of do due diligence, but after that, it's just the initial gut response is I believe the human care would be, would provide better care and would be able to be more flexible, anticipate sort of emergencies and so on in a way that robotic care might not necessarily be able to. So in terms of social consequences, some of the jobs might disappear, others might increase, or perhaps some of these, what we've seen in the sort of in the more paid labor market of similar technologies, which we could think about educational technologies that have parallels. They're used in schools, and they can be used in the home as parents are trying to teach children different skills. What we see is at the moment when technologies come in schools, what happens is de-skilling to some extent, where teachers are drawn upon, we teacher to student ratio could change in an unfavorable way. There are more students, they're paired with technology, and the teacher becomes the instructor who makes sure everyone's connected and the technology sort of works. And there's a parallel to that again with elder care homes. A colleague of mine did really interesting work and published a book saying robots won't save Japan. The fieldwork happened in Japan, and he looked at all these fancy robots that are used in elder care homes. And the idea behind them was everyone's better off. There's this cuddly robots and interactive robots, and then the social workers can do their job too, but then the social workers' labor gets eaten up because they have to make sure the robots work, the different technologies are compatible, and so on. So I think these are some of the unintended consequences that we are likely to face, at least in the initial, as these different providers don't necessarily all speak to each other and so on, and people are less familiar with them.
This is actually really interesting. I want to pick a little bit on that issue of like caregiving, right? And there was another question from the audience, which I think is important, especially when you look at Japan, where they, as you say, they've already done a lot of advances in that direction. So what protections or guardrails can you think about put in place to ensure the safety of children or the elderly or people with disabilities when you have kind of like start having these robots take care of people, right? I mean, we do something similar for humans, right? If you hire a nanny, you do a background check, you make sure like they have a good driving record, things like that. So what would be the equivalent for technology, and who would have the liability in this case, right? If something goes wrong. So if the robot like malfunctions or something, drops the baby, things like that you can think of. I'm curious how you think about that.
So that's again, very interesting question, and makes me think of some of the points that Beth and Liz made also about autonomous vehicles, because in my head, autonomous vehicles are a nice parallel there. So on the one hand, there's been huge technology development in that field, and there's the cars, I think, have a lot of autonomous vehicle capabilities. We have been promised self-driving cars on the roads, I think, for decades by now, and we don't quite have them. And I think one of the big issues there is exactly these guardrails and who is going to be, so that hopefully not perhaps a very big percentage of the time, but when things go wrong, or when the self-driving car has to make a decision, who is going to be damaged, because the accident is inevitable. And, as a human, we somehow make it, but usually it's perhaps even, sometimes we don't think it through. We just have some kind of gut response because the time is very short. The self-driving car might have to make that decision. And I don't think we've kind of quite come to a solution where we're comfortable that, well, all things being equal, I don't know, the elderly is less valuable than the child, or the child is less valuable than the elderly, and so on. We don't quite. And I think there's big issues coming up, similar issues in the domestic sphere, especially with care, because if the floor is not clean, well, it's not very nice, but that's about it. The baby drops. There is much more concerns, and I think there's people are thinking about it and worrying about it, because at the moment a lot of the innovation, a lot of the most exciting things that happens largely in the company sphere. And there ultimately their motivation is profit making. And I believe that as there is more and more pressure on the state level, especially in richer countries, as the societies are graying, and Japan is a great example, but many others are following on that trajectory, our care needs as societies are going to go very much up. And as we've seen in some of the white papers, I think European Commission published one recently, saying that digital technologies in the future should play a bigger role in this space. It's really important to start thinking about the guardrails. And liabilities and who is going to be held responsible is one thing. Some of these technologies we could imagine like voice assistants, sort of communication devices, or something like a ChatGPT that was given as an example a moment ago. They maybe can't harm in the same way. They might give wrong advice, but generally, hopefully, no one's going to be seriously harmed by that. But there's other risks. They're going to learn a lot about households. They're going to hold all that information. Are we comfortable thinking about the for-profit making companies getting such detailed insights into our family life? Who is where at which point? What are the consumption patterns? I just can see that this such detailed level of information can be used in marketing at the very least. And of course, when we think about households, they often involve people who can't by themselves make this decision and give consent. Think about children, or maybe there's family where there is one household member which decides, and the others haven't thought it through, don't have the capacity to understand all the implications, and yet everyone's going to be affected. Everyone's data will be collected.
No, I think you raised really something very important, which is, I think, in the dash to kind of like put these systems in place, we have to be really careful to make sure we regulate it in a proper way, and we have a regulatory framework for this, right? Because when we look at data and privacy, the US has a very bad record even now. If we look at social media about cybersecurity and data safeguards, a lot of the data currently is not being safeguarded in the interest of consumers. And Congress has not been able to pass comprehensive privacy legislation. And so this will just be exacerbated on a much more massive scale with AI and with all the systems that are coming down the line. And I think, especially when you talk about unintended consequences, even with ChatGPT, right? Like, what if suddenly these systems can tell people, yeah, like, how do I build a bomb or something like that, right? How do you kind of like prevent these kinds of things, even with some guardrails? So I want to move over to Liz and Beth a little bit. How do you think about that from a policymaking perspective? Kind of like very brief, since we're running up to the end of the event, but
sure.
What is the role of regulators here, and how do you think about their kind of like their way of safeguarding the technology, making sure it works for the benefit for the majority of people?
So I'll start and just say, we are learning every day, right? As our regulators on this, but I think the safety and privacy issues absolutely are front and center. We didn't really talk that much about bias in these systems, but these models, especially, ChatGPT is an example of generative AI. There are a number of systems out there that are the primary LLM systems, and then other systems build on them. So, for example, Microsoft is using OpenAI's system and then connecting it to the web. But they're trained systems, so it depends a lot on what they are trained on, right? And you can see, and especially these image systems, I saw a demo yesterday where someone said, if you ask one of the systems for a beautiful woman and you ask it 10 times, you'll get 8, white, thin, young women, right? And so that's an artifact of how the system was built and how the system was trained, right? And so I think it's an interesting question with the role of policymaker, since these systems are going to have huge impact. They're already starting to have huge impact. It's, they're the fastest adopted technology ever since November 2022, right? So something like over 100 million people have tried the systems at least, right? And so faster than smartphones, faster than any other technology, they've been adopted. So when you have a technology that's going to be, again, that pervasive, right, that influential, that impactful, how it's developed, right, and so how it's trained, and then how it's deployed, it is a very interesting question what the regulatory implications of that are. And I would say it also is both going to vary by geography, and then the question is, how should it or not vary by geography, right? Like with most of these. One other area I would just mention that I don't think we've touched upon yet is with autonomous vehicles. Again, there's conversations about the vehicles themselves, but there's highway technology, infrastructure, network technology that for some of the systems has a huge impact. And so how that's in the realm of the, public policy regulation. So I think thinking about those systems, interoperability, how they're deployed, et cetera, makes a big deal. There are all kinds of discussions about ride-hailing laws, for example, right? And contractors and labor laws that affect the workforce and the work sphere, but that has direct impact on some of the conversations we're having around household labor in terms of who is performing this labor and how they're being treated and what benefits they're getting or not getting. And so all of the questions that I address and think about around workforce ecosystems have some level of implication also for all these conversations we're having about household labor. So those are just a few, and I'll pass it back to Beth for last any additions or anything I left off there.
I'll just make a very quick plug. I know that we only have a minute left, but I think we're going to see, Liz and I are organizational scholars. We study companies, businesses, corporations. We all know that when we download an app on our phone and we agree and install, we've agreed to all these things that maybe we don't realize, right? So I think the regulatory, unfortunately, continuing to work directly with the corporations to understand what exactly these tools are capable of, what they're gathering and what the safeguards are, is going to be important. And I say unfortunately, because I don't know that we've done a great job of that so far.
No, that's very true, I think. All right, so this was really fantastic. I really enjoyed very much your thoughts, your insights, and I'm glad that you're all working on this really important topic. So thank you, Ekaterina, thank you, Beth, and thank you, Liv. Anyone in the audience, we will have the video up afterwards, so you can go back and view it again. And thank you very much again.